There we go. Welcome everybody to Contemporary Issues class. Nice to have you all here today. Getting some feedback on our microphone. That's okay. I will fix that. Welcome and first-time visitors. We have two. I'm Steve, the leader of the class, and today we are going to have a good discussion on why bad things happen to good people, or the age-old question, of course, why does suffering happen at all? Why would a good God allow suffering to happen in this world? Lots of thoughts on that. But before we start with that, Zoomers, welcome. Nice to have you all here. Please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen when you're not speaking, and keep the background noise down that way. And we are recording for future playback too. And for those who missed the class and would like to see it, we have quite a few folks who like to watch the replay. So that's our public notice about that too. Other announcements. Mark's new book is out today, and if anybody would like to get a signed copy, you probably know he's going to be signing these at 11:30 afterwards on the north patio. And I've read an advanced copy of it, and it's a wonderful look at progressive Christianity and alternative ideas, and I highly recommend it. I think you would enjoy it. So with that, any other announcements?
Steve?
Okay, yes, sir.
Thinking of the refugee family that you and Vicki hosted, brought over, our kids recommended a film. If you're in the mood for a good feeling film, called The Two Swimmers on Netflix.
Okay.
Two sisters, Olympian swimmers, two swimmers, going from Syria to Berlin and what they went through. And it's a positive outcome, but on the other hand, some consequences, but highly recommended. It was very useful for us to get a better feeling of what you go through to be a refugee, what you have to go through, what they experience. It's a true story. Netflix, Two Swimmers.
Two Swimmers. Okay. Very good. Always good to get recommendations. Okay. Let's see. Vicki and I went to Kansas City last weekend, and well, yeah, we did some barbecue too, and yeah, went to the big church there, Church of the Resurrection, the Methodist church there, and saw friends, and so because that's where we came from. It was wonderful.
Adam's still preaching.
Adam is still preaching there. Yes, Adam Hamilton, and we stayed with friends from high school, good friends, high school, who are quite conservative. So we enjoyed talking with them sometimes. And so I told my friend Pete there that we were talking about this topic today, and Pete said, well, you know that 9/11 happened because God was punishing America for leaving, taking prayer out of school and turning away from God. And I said, Pete, that's not the God that I believe in. It's just that we have a difference of opinion. So it's a never-ending question of why would God allow suffering? Does he punish as a parent would? Lead us into trials? And so we're going to talk about that today. I read this little book 20 years ago or more, Doug, I think. You can tell I got a beat up little copy.
This is the newer copy.
Newer copy, yeah, by this rabbi. But first I want to introduce Doug Knispel, a friend of ours who's presented in this class before. And Doug has had several careers: police officer, smoke jumper, ski instructor most recently at Copper Mountain, and he loves to read and present topics. So we are glad to have, please welcome Doug Knispel.
Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me in the back? Because I hesitate to use the microphone only because I want to read from the book quite a bit. So please raise your hand if you can't hear me, because I will definitely use that. But it's a little easier for me from a managing standpoint, if that's okay. As Steve mentioned, I've done this, spoken several times before, and I've usually had a plethora of material I never got to. And
Let me
so,
go ahead and shut it off.
okay.
Sure. There we go. That's better.
So I asked him if we could extend the class by an hour and a half, and he. I don't know why he's being so difficult about it, so I will try to talk, I'll talk real fast, which I normally do. No, I'll try to slow it down, but you know, what we're gonna do is go through the first 4 chapters of the book and then have questions, and then through the last 4. The last 2 are, like in a lot of books, are the most significant, so I might have to skip. I'm sure I will, only because there's just a plethora of material here. But Harold Kushner, a rabbi out of Massachusetts, who actually just recently died in April of this year, wrote this book as a result of this terrible disease. And I'm assuming everybody had a chance to read the preface I sent out. If I'm pronouncing it right, called Progera, which literally is the wasting away of somebody in front of your eyes. I mean, his son died 3 days after he turned 14. And as I said, he never had any hair in his body. He basically never grew more than 3 feet. It's just rapid aging, and they don't really have an understanding of it in terms of this, but terrible disease. That he wrote this because his condition required it, or you know, tried to explain it, and his death demanded it that he do. Why do good things happen to bad things happen to good people? In the book, he basically says, he wrote it for all those people who want to go on believing, but whose anger at God made it hard for them to hold on to their faith and be comforted by their religion. And as a rabbi, I figure he knows a lot about what he's talking about. I'm going to go through each chapter individually, and so we can go ahead and put the slides up and turn over to chapter 1, if you don't mind, Steve.
Sure.
Anyway, in chapter 1, and I've subtitled each of the chapters in terms of this. So the first chapter is basically why the righteous suffer. And my synopsis, or it is misunderstandings about God in the Bible, in terms of this. And again, it's kind of prolific considering a rabbi is writing about this. And he's writing about it from the Old Testament, which is, of course, the bread and butter as a Jewish rabbi. He says that religion very often, in terms of tragedy, makes people feel worse. We were talking recently about another famous author called Bart Ehrlichman, who's been here before, written about 18 or 19 books, wrote a scholar out of North Carolina, who was raised as a fundamentalist and turned into an atheist for this very question of why, you know, bad things happen to good people, and the fact that God would not allow this. And Kushner's trying to explain this, again, through his own personal experience. So I'm going to do a lot of quotes of short readings from the book just to try to get understanding here what's going on. So some of the things that are misunderstandings about the Bible in terms of that. The misfortunes of good people are not only a problem for the people who suffer and to their families, they are a problem to everyone who wants to believe in a just and fair, livable world. The inevitable raises questions about the goodness, the kindness, and even the existence of God. And Kushner says, I have to ask myself, could I, in good faith, continue to teach people the world is good and that a kind and loving God is responsible for what happens in it, especially after what happened to him? So, you know, and again, as a rabbi, he's having a lot of people coming to him with this very question in terms of this, and he's trying to deal with it himself. But he said that the condition of his son required him to write a book like this. And so this is what happened on it. It starts out with several quotes from the Bible, which basically go against or goes into the old, what would be called the fundamentalist theory about God and what, you know, good and bad. And I'm going to quote from Genesis 38:7. But Aaron, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Another one from Proverbs. No ills befall the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Another one from Job. Consider, what innocent person ever perished, and where have the righteous been destroyed? These are all questions raising out or just saying that God basically is punishing you if you're bad. And if you're good, you're going to, you know, have a strong life, et cetera, et cetera. The other one that's really kind of instrumental in here, there's one that's from Psalms. And I'm going to paraphrase from Psalms 92. How great are your deeds, O Lord? Your thoughts are very deep. The ignorant man does not comprehend them. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree and grow mightily like the cedar of Lebanon. again, going through this same theme that basically if you're good, you're going to be fine. If you're bad, you know, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And that basically God has kind of responded. That's the message that's coming out of here, which again, to me, he's denying, and he will deny as we go through the book, in terms of that, which is to me very significant since it's coming from the Old Testament. He goes through, and he struggles with this, but he has another classic example from this in terms of that. And I want to quote something that comes from Adolf Hitler, or a discussion about Adolf Hitler. He says, how seriously would we take a person who said, I have faith in Adolf Hitler or in John Dillinger. I can't explain why they did the things they did, but I can't believe they would have done them without good reason. Yet people try to justify the deaths and the tragedies God inflicts upon innocent victims with almost the same words. And I thought that's quite dramatic in terms of that. That basically he's saying that, you know, again, he has this. The one criticism I have about him is that he's a little repetitious, but he does it in different ways. And he's coming back to this thing, and he will say it over and over again, that God is not responsible in terms of that. Another part that comes from the book in terms of this, we're told God treats us in a wise, caring parent, as a wise caring parent treats a naive child, keeping us from hurting ourselves, withholding something we may want, punishing us occasionally to make sure we understand what we've done something wrong, and enduring our temper tantrums at his unfairness in the confidence that one day mature and understanding will all be for our good. Again, going that God has this control over us, or maybe control is not the right word, but overlook over all of us in terms of everything we do. And he's quite strong about the fact that that's not the way that he feels it is. Another one that comes from Proverbs, I find it over here. For whom the Lord loves, he chastises, even as a father does to the son. Again, same sort of a theme. God is punishing you or chastising you in terms of that if you're doing bad, in terms of that. Other things that come out of this come the fact that everything happens for a purpose. No, they don't. But that comes out, obviously, in terms of a lot of, especially, again, people that are on the far right of the religious spectrum in terms of that. God is not like a loving parent, as we've been talking about, that tries to discipline you if you are doing things wrong. God does not test people. And God never sends us a burden you can't handle. He says that's totally wrong. That, you know, there is not that reason that happens in terms of this. So in the summary of the very first chapter, in terms of this, and he says a lot of it, I'll quote from the ends of it because it's good summaries. Could it be that God does not cause the bad things that happen to us? Could it be he doesn't decide which family shall give birth to a handicapped child, nor did he single out Ron, talking about a previous person came to him crippled by a bullet, or Helen by a degenerative disease? But rather he stands ready to help them and help us cope with our tragedies, if we only get beyond the feeling of guilt and anger that separates us from him. Could it be that how could God do this to me is really the wrong question for us to answer, or us to ask? So again, this sets the stage for the theme that he's booked. And I mean, you know, you can say in a nutshell that basically this addresses the question a little bit. I mean, he explains some more detail about how God can try to help you in his minds, but he's saying very emphatically, God is not responsible for the things that happen. For people that are our side of the religious ledger, that's probably acceptable. For people on the right side of the religious ledger, it's probably not very much, especially on the fundamentalist side. He goes into the second chapter is a book called chapter 2. You want to hit that slide over there, Steve, I don't mind. In chapter 2 is the story of a man named Job. I'm not going to go into that very much, only because of sake of time. But he says that Job is a very, very difficult book to understand. It's not easy. He says there's actually 2 Hebrew translations of Job, which are interesting. One of which says, I will fear God, and another one that says, I will not fear God. So they're obviously opposites in terms of that. But again, for the sake of time, I don't want to get too much into it. There is one or two quotes that I want to do out of it real quickly if I can. In terms of it. We can maintain our own self-respect and sense of goodness without having to feel that God has judged us and condemned us. We can be angry at what happens to us without feeling that we are angry at God. More than that, we can recognize our anger at life's unfairness, our instinctive compassion at seeing people suffer, as coming from a God who teaches us to be angry at injustice and to feel compassion for the afflicted. Instead of feeling that we are opposed to God, we can feel that our indignation is God's anger at unfairness working through us, that when we cry out, we are still on God's side and he is still on ours. So he's addressing this question basically that God is with us from a compassionate standpoint and supporting us from a compassionate standpoint. And he's also saying again, and he will say throughout the book, but God is not responsible with it in any degree for this.
But Job's friends in the story said, what sins have you done that would punish you to such a degree?
Yes,
right?
and he does that, and it's interesting in terms of this, and making Job feel bad, and he says in the book here, he says it makes everybody feel good about it except the victim, being in this case Job. In terms of what happened on it. So yeah, Job is an interesting book, but it is a little bit hard to understand in terms of
that book.
The third chapter.
Job.
He says, who wrote Job? Do we know who wrote Job?
No, not to my knowledge. I'm not a theologian to exactly say that, but I do not know who wrote Job whatsoever.
Okay, I'm just curious.
But it's interesting that mindset continues today, that when bad things happen, many people say, what did I do to deserve this? Why is God punishing me or testing me?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easy. It's easy to put the blame on God.
Yes,
I think
very
that,
much so.
Yeah, I think that we are trained somehow with a mindset to blame God because it's easier.
It's one of the omnis. God is all powerful. So if he has all that power, this stuff must be under his control.
Exactly. Very well said. I mean, in terms of that.
Omniscient also.
But again, what I find significant is a rabbi, a man of the cloth, is talking and preaching from, again, his gospel being the Old Testament, is saying, no, that is not true. So again, obviously against more of a fundamentalist standpoint, but basically saying that God is not responsible, but he suffers with you in terms of when you have tragedies and stuff like that. And he's trying to console you, and he's actually trying to console you through friends in terms of that. And we'll come to that a little bit in terms of this.
I want you to make sense, if you can, before you're done, about that question. If God is all powerful and loving at the same time, why do we suffer?
Well, I think you have to go to, when you talk about the definition of all powerful, because I believe he is all powerful, and I think most of us believe that, but not necessarily responsible for our individual lives. And he goes back to Adam and Eve, and he talked in the book. There was a choice in Genesis with Adam and Eve, and he said one of the big differences between animals and humans is the fact that men or humans basically can choose. Animals are instinctive in what they do. We have a choice in what we do. So Hitler chose to be bad in terms of that. That's a human characteristic, not something that God does upon us, if that makes any sense. And so a lot of the evil, again, is created by not only natural things, but also evil people, is a result of their doing, which God is neutral on, because he's given us that choice to be good or bad.
Right.
Well,
That's my understanding of the basic premise of the book, is that God gave us free will to make our own choices, and he would not intervene and stop us from making those choices or suffering the consequences. And so in the vast majority of cases, people make choices, Hitler and others, and that will just play out, but God will stop it, and he is just with us as we go through that. if he were to have created a world where we did not suffer and we would not have free will and we would not have those choices, we would not have the experiences and the growth, and that this was just God's choice of the model for us to live in. Trying to summarize that.
Yeah.
Ron.
That explains some things, but we still struggle with why does a cosmic ray from outer space strike a cell in our brain and start a tumor? You know, it's something you did.
That is a beautiful lead-in. I appreciate that very much, sir. Ron, we didn't plan that, Ron, but you did a great job on that. Because chapter 3, because what we're talking about explains the first part of the question, basically, in terms of there's bad people that do bad things to bad people and cause people sometimes to suffer. But as Ron is bringing out, what about what we call randomness? Okay, sometimes there is no reason. I call that chapter 3 randomness in terms of it. And he has a classic example of this, which I think might address your question. And it's a little bit lengthy, but very powerful. When a man and a woman join in making love, the man ejaculates swarms of tens of millions of sperm cells. Each one carries a slightly different set of biologically inherited characteristics. No moral intelligence decides which one of these teeming millions will fertilize a waiting egg. Some of the sperm cells will cause a child to be born with a physical handicap, perhaps a fatal calamity. Others will give them not only good health, but superior athletic or musical ability or creative intelligence. The child's life will be wholly shaped. The lives and parents and relatives will be equally affected by random determination. And that's basically what he's saying, going back a little bit to your question. It's random determination is what happens, whether it's that cosmic ray coming out of sun, out of the universe, or basically you're having a child that basically has a defect in some way or another that you have to live with for the rest of your life. Again, just total randomness of that, and again, without his involvement. But I thought that was a pretty powerful quote of that particular situation. Another one that he says along these same lines: I understand that high dry weather, weeks without rain, increases the danger of forest fire, so that a spark, a match, sunlight focused on a shaded glass can set a forest ablaze. I understand the course of that fire will be determined by other things, the direction in which the wind blows. But is there a sensible explanation for why wind and weather combine to direct a forest fire on a given day towards certain homes rather than others, trapping some people inside, sparing others? Or is it just a matter of pure luck or pure randomness? And I think we can relate to that here in Colorado because we've had that severe experience just recently. And of course, and so I was going to say now today with Maui, it's the same sort of a thing. Even with that town being destroyed by what, 80 or 90%, there's a few homes that are still standing in terms of that. So he is saying in here that basically there is a lot of randomness in the world that occurs. That, and again, this thing about birth and why children become bad is not bad, but become or have a defect of some sort is basically due to the fact that they got a bad egg from a bad, or I mean bad sperm, I should say, from creating a bad egg. If that makes sense. Or not sense, I should say, but explanation would be a better word to say in terms of that. So that's what he's trying to say in here. And at the end of this chapter, he's saying that residential chaos, chance and mischance, things happen for no reason and will continue to be with us. In that case, we will simply have to learn to live with it, sustained and comforted by the knowledge that the earthquake and the accident, like the murder and the robbery, are not the will of God, but represent the aspect of reality which stands independent of his will and which angers and saddens God, even as it angers and saddens us. He repeats that theme through the book, that God is basically crying with us when we have tragedies in terms of that. He's trying to support us, again, through mechanisms such as other people and stuff like this, and hopefully the comforting words of religion, although there are some that go against it, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. But basically, God is supporting us in terms of that, but he's also not involved in that. it's one of these things that it comes down to belief. I mean, in all honesty, I mean, which again, from this audience, I think would be, again, much more understandable than it would be from somebody who's on the far right of the spectrum in terms of that.
Different perspective.
I'll do one more on chapter 4, and then we can ask some more detailed questions if you have something on this. But in chapter 4, no exceptions for nice people. My subtitle on that is God is not responsible. Again, he says that pain can be good, and he explains why, and adjustments to tragedy and death. There's a quote from page 68, which is fairly long, and I'm just going to paraphrase some parts of it. But he's big on this, and I'm sure you've heard this when I come to it. Insurance companies refer to earthquakes, hurricanes, and other natural disasters as acts of God. I consider that a case of using God's name in vain. I don't believe that an earthquake kills thousands of innocent victims without reason is an act of God. It's an act of nature.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's almost, you know, you can count on it. However, I think a lot of it is just like, I'll give you another kind of extreme example. When you meet somebody, you say, how are you today? They're not really interested in how you are today, but it's a greeting, okay?
Right.
This is not a greeting, but it's just, you know, we're saying that without necessarily feeling it, that God is coming down from the heavens and causing this to happen or whatever like that. But this is he's very much against using that term, acts of God. Because he's saying that, and going back into your thing, sir, is that, yeah, God is omnipotent in our feelings, but basically that he's not controlling the everyday aspects of our life, which again comes down to religious perspective, probably, you know, right versus left in terms of your beliefs of that.
Yeah, God set up the model of the earth having tectonic plates that are gonna move and gonna kill people when the earthquakes happen. But people also wonder, Doug, why didn't God create the earth in some other way where there was not these kind of sufferings and randomness? If he was omnipotent, why wouldn't he have created it some other way? And one of Rabbi's suggestions is maybe God couldn't. Maybe that was the only way there was to create this earth. There was no other method. And so we just have to accept it and not live in those places where there's gonna be earthquakes. It's up to us.
You only had a first generation 3D printer.
There you go.
We don't like to think that. We like to think that God could have done any method he wanted to, so why did he do with the tectonic plates? But the rabbi and even Mark Feldmeyer would subscribe to this too in his new book, saying maybe God didn't have that power. Maybe we should just consider that possibility.
I think we all know that there's we look for hard facts because especially in this world, you know, prove it to me or whatever like that.
Right.
And we all know that religion is not hardly factual. I mean, only because there's things that went on when we weren't around and all the other things that go. Some of it has to be faith and understanding of how we believe. But I mean, I believe that, and I would think the majority here from this religious aspect would feel the same way. God is not an evil person. He's not going to condemn us and try to slew us, as it said in Genesis, just because we're a bad person or something like that. He wants to support us. He wants to help us. He wants to give us comfort, which this church is big on, basically, of people surrounding you in times of tragedy and your support group. And the Jewish religion does a phenomenal job of this. I'll get to this a little bit later in the book of how to support people in times of tragedy. In this chapter here, no exceptions for nice people, there is a disease which I cannot pronounce. If anybody's a linguist, they can. Familiar, and I cannot pronounce the name of that last one there.
Dysautonomia.
Very good. I appreciate that. I'll use you on the next one too. 1 out of every 400,000 people is born without the ability to feel pain. However, he says pain is God's way of our body not functioning as it was meant to be, or is being asked for us to do more than was intended. And I say that, when I say that, it has to remind me of a good friend of ours called Doug Moen, who was playing pickleball a while back, and basically he was trying to emulate that he was 30 or 31 now instead of what he is. and had a broken tendon, right, in terms of that, but he's, you know, it happens, you know, in terms of this, but pain is good in the sense that it's telling us something is wrong with our body or that we're doing something incorrectly, whether it's stepping on a thorn that, you know, could penetrate your foot, or you're feeling something inside with your heart that you know, want to go to the doctor, et cetera, to try to get treated on. So he's saying that, yes, pain is, quote, painful, but it can be very beneficial because it's giving you a warning sign. And the danger is if you can't feel pain, which again, he's saying 1 out of 400,000 people have this situation, which means they have to live in a bubble. When you think about it, they in terms of what they do because they can't feel things. I have neuropathy, which I'm sure some of you probably do, which is a lack of feeling in parts of your extremities. And I have to be very, very careful with that. I've had a couple toes amputated, which affects me because I'm a skiing. Well, I thought it would affect me. Unfortunately, it hasn't. But because I could not feel pain in my toes, and my toes got infected, and the bone got infected. And if your bone ever gets infected, the only thing they can do is amputate it. And fortunately, it was done on small toes that basically didn't really affect my balance or whatever like this. But, you know, neuropathy is a dangerous thing, but it's not nearly as bad as the ability to feel no pain. So he's saying that basically pain is something that, you know, as it says in here, it makes us bitter and envious. It makes others sensitive and compassionate. It's the result of pain, not the cause, that makes the experience meaningful to some and destructive to others. And, you know, he doesn't go into this directly, but thinking that maybe this is one of the things that God gave us to be able to understand when our body's not functioning at 100%, and for one reason why. You know, which goes back to the original premise that God is a loving, kind judge. But we, you know, randomness and control of our bodies and stuff like this is what causes problems to happen. He uses an example over here too, a little bit lower on that slide. There's one advantage that animals have over humans, which is genetic improvement. And what he means by that is the fact that if you have an animal that is crippled, having a problem, you know, in terms of functioning and something like that, there's a very, very good chance they're not going to mate. And that causes selective breeding, where the strong survive and the weak die. I mean, we know about that from biology in terms of that. As humans, we don't believe in that. If we have somebody who is got some sort of a degenerative disease or something like that, we try to take care of him or her. We try to, you know, nothing wrong with them having a mate and having children or whatever like that. But we are indirectly propagating that. Not in a negative way, because we're kind and loving people.
Interesting.
But it causes that to happen. With animals, it doesn't, because animals through time become stronger in terms of things like that. And so he's basically saying here that evolution is a long, long process in terms of it. But it's, to me, a very interesting explanation of that. Another thing that he talks about in the same chapter is death, and talking about being mortal. And mortal is good. It's good in the sense, well, he quotes Homer. Homer, if you remember from Greek mythology, was deemed to live forever. And he says, Homer envied being mortal, because living with knowledge that we will die may be frightening and tragic, but knowing you would never die would be unbearable. And I think that's true.
Interesting.
You know, and interesting, as you may have read, you know, they're saying that a child today who's born has the theoretical possibility to live well into their hundreds, maybe 110, 120. I mean, it's come on.
Really?
However, you think about this, I says, you still got to go through, and we all know this very much from either our ages or friends that are basically our age, whatever. That doesn't mean everybody's healthy when they get older. And there's people obviously that die. And, you know, you think about the person, I was reading a book, I was telling Steve, a book called Man Named Charlie, written by a guy 109 years old. Very interesting book, which I might even do something on later. But anyway, the sad part about that is having all your friends die, you know, or most of them die or something like that. And then you get to that point where, and I'm not trying to be morbid here. I'm just talking about reality, which I think we face very well at our age, to be honest with you. This would be a hard discussion to have with somebody 35 years old. You know, but we see, I think, the reality of life in terms of that in there. But, you know, the mortality is good, and he writes it in a way in the book. If I don't quote it, I'll tell it to you right now. But basically, vulnerability to death is a condition of life. We can all we can say to someone at a time like that, and he's talking about death in terms of that. The vulnerability is death is one of the given conditions of life. We can't explain it any more than we can explain life itself. We can't control it, and sometimes we can't even postpone it. All we can try to do is to try to rise above the question, why did it happen? And begin to ask the question, what do I do now that it has happened? But he says one of the ways that as humans, what we try to do is to symbolize our existence through writing books, more importantly, having children, you know, or friends or something like that, to bring our memory going forward in terms of that. That's how we deal with mortality and the fact that we know we're going to die. Animals don't know they're going to die. So I thought that's an interesting perspective on being mortal, and the fact that, no, there's not necessarily a good part about it. Well, I suppose, again, you know, there is, if you had to live forever. But the point is that, in terms of that.
I know you wanted me to let you know when it was 11:05 and allow some discussion.
Yeah, I know it covered quite a bit in a short period of time, but I didn't know any other questions so far. Yes, sir.
I lost a good friend 30 years ago, and a month after she was murdered at work, about a month after, I remember having the thought, whether it was God or my own thought, that I can get bitter or I can get better. And I chose to get better as a result of the experience, rather than being bitter. Because I remember when I was sweeping the kitchen at Iowa State, it's 15 hours a week to pay for my room and board. I can remember the lady on the lunch line saying to me, "Oh, I could never believe in God." Because he took my father with cancer. He took my father with cancer, and I just don't see him as being a good God. And then I went to a pastor not long after that, and the pastor said, well, she had two ways to respond. She could thank God for the 65 years that she had with her father, or she could blame God because he died of cancer. She had a choice.
Steve, you've done a miraculous job of giving me lead-ins. I really appreciate that. This is a great lead-in to another point I wanted to bring up that I was going to read from, and I still might, but again, there's so much in here that I know we're not going to quite get to everything. He talks about a survivor of Auschwitz. And basically he talks about the tragedy, which is probably one of the greatest that happened to human beings in this world, but he lived through it. He raised a family, had children, etc. The children and his wife were killed in a forest fire. And he dealt with it, and people asked for it. He says, we need to have an inquisition, an inquiry as to why the fire happened, you know, investigation and all that. And he says, no. We can't look at the past. We can only go forward. And I thought, talking from somebody who came from that background, that is remarkable. I mean, I know personally I don't know how I could ever live through the condition that the Jews did in World War II. But then to have it happen again after you've survived that, and to have your family die and still have that perspective, to me is quite remarkable.
But to have that perspective assumes that you believe in a God that is omnipowerful, can stop the suffering. And that's not where a lot of these theologians are going. They don't believe that. And
I think we can really learn from the past, especially with the troublesome fire. I had a family friend who had a family home go up in smoke, and she constantly planted trees really close. It was completely made out of wood. The only thing was metal roof. She did not mitigate. They had a wood pile really, really close. You know, I spent quite a bit of time up there. So I had seen it just before that fire went through. Just down the road, a place that had been built fairly early was made out of materials that were more fireproof. They did not have trees near there, and they had put rocks all the way around. So I think there are things, you know, that we can learn from the past that we are not doing. Still, Grant County, unless they've changed their mind, still does not enforce with the new builds that they're building, any kind of rules or regs, that people have to do. And I think, we've got to look at life in a different way and that we can learn from the past.
I agree with you, and I don't think what I was trying to say there earlier was there's the difference between learning from the past and looking back at the past or living in the past type thing. And what he's saying is, yeah, we can certainly learn from things in the past, especially examples that you're quoting from, but if we go back to, inquisitions in this case, inquiries as to why did they let this fire get out of control, as we've tried to do here in our recent tragedies and we're trying to do with Maui. He says that's one perspective, but the other one is trying to look forward. Another thing that he brings out in the book, by the way, is that what God gives us is the ability to rebound from tragedies. And if you think about that, I mean, we have miraculous after story about people that have taken terrible sufferings. Again, go back to the Jews during World War II, but among people with natural disasters. Look at Maui. All they're talking, obviously they're talking about having inquiries as to what happened there and how it happened, etc. But they're also talking even now about rebuilding. The fire's not even out yet totally in terms of this. Yeah. But, he's saying that God gives us the human nature to rebound along with people that support us around us and move forward rather than looking back.
Yeah. That brings up the question of chapter 4 and pain, where people have pain that's chronic, it's unexplainable, and they're not going to get out of it. They're doomed to have pain for the rest of their life. They're not learning something about pain. Maybe it changes their theological perspective, but what's the point for that person's life when they can't learn out of or get out of that pain?
It's a great question for Reverend Mark, and he's not here.
I want to go ahead and offer our Zoom folks a chance to ask a question or make a comment so they don't feel like they're intruding. Anybody want to? Susan or Joe or Sue or Toby? Okay, just wanted to offer that to you. Okay, go ahead. I think Vicki was next and then Ron.
I had an amazing counselor when I went through a really rough time in my life. I had a really amazing counselor when I went through a rough time in my life. And he was a very dedicated professor at a very conservative school. But as I counseled with him, he explained to me my choice, bitter or better, And he also said, it's okay for you to take a break from the religious forms that you're used to. Take a step back and let God, only God, minister to you. First, make the choice to do better than bitter. And then just step back. Don't put yourself in the situation where people are going to be coming up to you and saying, oh, bless your heart. Or they're thinking, what did you do to cause this? Or that kind of stuff. Remove yourself from that. Because God's faithfulness in ministering to you as a person will come, and through other people. So I think it's okay in our suffering to not continue to submit yourself in some forms to this business of what did you do? Or, oh, bless your heart, because you can't heal that way. You have to remove yourself from that. And because, as well-meaning as they are, religious institutions are not always the best thing for hurting people. They're not. So I thought it was amazing. Counsel.
There's an article on mental health in this morning's Denver Post Sunday edition. And one of the things that jumped out at me was the counselor. It's a complex article, but he basically says we need to find ways, particularly for young people, to build in and help them develop more resilience. And we can talk about all the ways resilience gets built in. It might be faith, it might be friendships, it might be something else, but we need to find ways to get more resilience built into young people today.
Ron, that's another great lead in, which I'll compensate for you, at the end of the class. But and then I'll get right to you, sir, is basically that one of the things that God has done is basically give us people that want to go into medicine and people that want to go into research to find cures for diseases. I mean, you look at all the research that has been done that has made life better for us over the years. And he's saying God is giving us those kind of people that have that mentality. Doctors, I mean, obviously they get paid a lot, but basically they could never make the amount of money they do for the good that they do in the world, per se. And they drive people to be doctors, because they love the profession, they help helping people. Terms of that. And so God is he's saying that God is driving that to help us be better.
We have a major epidemic in this country. I'm plugging another film here called the painkillers. Your comments about pain. We have this opioid epidemic in our country with fentanyl and OxyContin and so forth, and the multi-million-dollar lawsuits are pending in the courts right now as we speak. Your book review is so helpful, I think, for all of us, how you use pain when kids today, and so many of us, want to remove pain, emotional pain and physical pain, and they're bedfellows. And a lot of people are taking these pain meds for emotional pain as much as the physical pain. But you're suggesting here in this book, very helpful, how pain can actually strengthen our empathy for other people who are hurting.
Yes.
A psychopath and a sociopath don't have any emotional pain because nothing bothers them. It makes it much easier to deal with a lot of things. The people who feel pain, right, and can feel other people's pain. Kent Clinton used to say, "I feel your pain." You remember that?
Yeah.
But he resonated because so many people are hurting today, emotionally and physically. So this matter of pain, and the pressure on docs today and people in the mental health field, certainly. Get rid of the pain, doc. Get rid of the pain. Can't stand it.
A little takeoff on that, as you're saying, is that fact. Well, if you talk to a young person, somebody who's late teens or 20s, whatever, and you're talking about your body ailments or whatever like that, they can't relate to that. Yeah. They can relate to that as they get older because they run into the same situation. Yeah. But it's kind of a classic difference between what happens when you're younger versus older, but it kind of leverages off of what you're trying to say. And he's saying that pain can be good in that perspective. I want to give you a good quote from a book that was written by The Faith and Doubt of Holocaust Survivors, which was in Kushner's book. It never occurred to me, and this is a survivor of Auschwitz, it never occurred to me to question God's doing or lack of doing when I was an inmate of Auschwitz. Although, of course, I understand others did. I was no less, no more religious because of what the Nazis did to us. And I believe my faith in God was not undermined in the least. It never occurred to me to associate the calamities we are experiencing with God, to blame him or to believe in him less or cease believing in him at all because he didn't come to our aid. God doesn't owe us that or anything. We owe our lives to him. If someone believes God is responsible for the death of 6 million because he didn't somehow do something to save them, he's got his thinkings reversed. We owe God for our lives, for the few or many years we live, and we have a duty to worship him and do as he wants us. That's what we're here on earth for, to be God's service, to be God's bidding. But I thought that was quite remarkable coming from this person for what he lived through. And I'm not saying that, maybe that's quite on the far right side of the spectrum, but another way to look at it in terms of the suffering, again, from one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the world.
Different views of God. Yeah. We've got 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I know we do. Now, so I'm going to skip chapter 6. I am gonna quote one thing because it's very pertinent in here in terms of today's world in many ways. Let me give you in talking about it's okay to be angry. He says in the book, it's okay to be angry at God. Don't, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be careful how you direct your anger. And he quotes a very sad example that I'm sure some of us have seen, hopefully not experienced, and that's the death of a child. When a death of a child occurs, okay, quotes that come from between husband and spouse, man and wife, okay? As maybe if you had fed him better, if he hadn't gotten chilled on that stupid fishing trip. My side of the family has always been healthy. It's your relatives who are disease prone. Okay. A man and a woman who care about each other have been hurt badly. Because they were hurt, they are angry, and they direct their anger at the closest available target. And we all know of people, and I have, that have had divorces in their family because of the death of a child, which is probably one of the more traumatic things that experience in life. He says, sometimes if we can't find another person to dump our anger on, we turn it upon ourselves. He says the textbook definition of depression is anger turned inward instead of being discharged outward. If we want to blame ourselves, we want to hurt ourselves. We want to punish ourselves for what we messed up. And sometimes we're angry at God because we were brought up to believe that everything that happens is his will. Going back to what you're saying, sir. Which again is not saying. So again, he's dealing with, it's okay to be angry, but be careful how you direct your anger. Chapter 7 is basically God can't do everything, but he can do some important things. I call it the prayer chapter. And he talks that we have to understand right versus wrong prayer. The wrong prayer, I mean, there's a quote in here in terms of that. Please, you're hearing something on the radio about a fire in your neighborhood, okay? And you say, as you're doing it, please God, don't let there be a fire in my house. He's saying that's a wrong prayer because that fire occurred. It was random, or there was a cause for it that he was not involved with, and you can't do anything about it. And God's not going to do anything about it because God is not in control of that, which again, for some people is very hard to understand in terms of this. But that lightning strike that came down, going back to a random thing or whatever like that, and whether it's your house or your neighbor's house is not something God is going to help you with. He quotes another thing. You're applying for college and you're about to open up the letter, and he says, please let this be a letter of admission that I get into this school. I'm sure we can relate to stuff like that. But again, we're using prayer in that wrong way. Those things have already been determined, and God, more importantly, was never involved in that. He quotes another thing on miracles, which I want to quite read from real quickly. Grab it here. When miracles occur and people beat the odds against their survival, we will be well advised to bow our heads in thanks at the presence of the miracle and not think that our prayers, our contributions are what did it. Because the next time we try, maybe we may wonder why our prayers are not answered. Again, another thing, he's not necessarily, in fact, he's talking that miracles occur, but the miracles that occur is a substance that gives us strength to deal with disaster after. It gives us the friends that are surround us in times of tragedies, or religious institutions such as this one that give us support when those things happen. That's what God is doing. That was considered to be more or less miracles in that perspective. Okay, that makes sense. So I think that's very, very strong in terms of it. Another thing that I want to bring in this chapter here, there's 3 very strong Jewish beliefs, which I think we could all learn from. One of which is called Shiva at the top, the Memorial Week after a death, where you come and you share your fears, your griefs with the mourners. And it allows spiritual and emotional healing. And they do this for a whole week after a death. The mourners sit with the parents, the spouse, or the child. There's another one, which I can't pronounce at all, the one that's underlined over there, and it's written out because it's in Hebrew. It's where people at a wake feed the mourners. Again, as a sign of support that's coming through. I think a very, very strong one. The last one is called the Mourner's Kaddish there, if I'm saying that right. It's a prayer recited for a year after a death, but not about death, but about the life and praises to God for creating a basically good and livable world. Knowing that others' care can affect the course of someone's health. And that's true. I really believe that from my experience. I know people are caring and giving you calls. And again, I think church is very big on that, but we want to really continue to be big on that. But he's saying that, the other thing he brings up is the fact there's a lot more good in this world than there is bad. I mean, unfortunately, when we look at the news, if it's a 30-minute newscast, 28 minutes of it is bad news, and they'll end with one good news, which is good. But, you know, I know that they've had stations that tried to do all good news and they didn't work, and I don't know. Sad to say, but I guess we're morbid in our own sense of wanting to do that. Okay, so anyway, but that's very interesting. And what I can do with a little bit of time that we have left, I want to do another one, which is right there. I believe God does not send us the problem. He gives us the strength, the patience, and the hope to deal with the problem and renew our spiritual resources when they run dry. And I'll do one more that's actually from chapter 8 toward the end of which is a very strong end to the book, because there may be a few questions toward the end, but I want to read. It's lengthy, but it's well worth it. In the final analysis, the question of why bad things happen to good people translates itself into some very different questions. No longer asking why something happened, but how it happened, how we will respond, and what we intend to do about it now that it has happened. Are you capable of forgiving and accepting in love a world which has disappointed you by not being perfect? A world in which there is so much unfairness and cruelty, disease and crime, earthquakes and accidents. Can you forgive its imperfections and love it because it is capable of containing great beauty and great goodness, and because it is the only world we have? Are you capable of forgiving and loving people who are around you, even if they hurt you and let you down by not being perfect? Because none of us are perfect. Can you forgive them and love them? Because there aren't any perfect people around, and because the penalty for not being able to love imperfect people is condemning yourself to loneliness. Are you capable of forgiving and loving God even when you found out that He is not perfect? Even when He has let you down and disappointed you by permitting bad luck or sickness or cruelty in this world, and permitting some of those things happening to you? Can you learn to love and forgive Him despite His limitations, as Job did? The ability to forgive and the ability to love are the weapons God has given us, and enable us to live fully, bravely, and meaningful in this less than perfect world. And he closes with, I think of Aaron and all the life has taught me, and I realize how much I have lost and how much I have gained. Yesterday seems less painful, and I am not afraid of tomorrow. So I think we have like 3 minutes left.
I'd like to share something that, besides the bitter, better idea, I'd like to share something that helped me go through that. Greeting. Eric's a little louder. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And that's what really spoke to me, because it caused me to look outward to others who were experiencing the same thing. It was only a couple years later that I had a student who committed suicide. And I didn't know him real well, but I went to his visitation and I stood next to the casket and allowed his father to unload on me. His father was a doctor, and he says, I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be able to save people, and I can't do anything. But you know, he's reaching out. He's frantic because he's a doctor and he couldn't save his son's life. But I was able to share with him my experience with his friend who was murdered in San Diego. And I think it might have given him some comfort at that point in time.
And there's the related passage that says, James 1, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds and sufferings, because your faith is increased, and you will learn patience, strength, and virtue. So looking at the positive side of having sufferings. Jim.
I think Rabbi Kushner has written a very insightful book, and that we all ought to put it on our to-read list.
Yeah, like I said, he wrote it in 81. It became a bestseller. But Steve and I were talking, but it's just as applicable today, if maybe even more so than it was in 81 when he wrote it.
Yeah, there's lots of truths in there. I read it some time ago too. It's an excellent book.
Because as we've all said before, this is a question that stumps us every day, you know, wondering on. But I think it gave me certainly a different perspective on looking at tragedy in terms of that. And what God can do and what He can't. Pardon?
And the Bible, too,
yes,
on what the Bible is, because there are obviously those passages that say, if you are righteous and keep with God, then nothing bad will happen to you. He will save you from all evil occurrences, that kind of thing. So what is the Bible? Is it God telling us things, or is it man trying to understand and offer our own thoughts?
Yeah, very much so.
Sometimes, in order to keep people in check, you know, if you're good, then we probably won't have a lot of problems with you in this community.
Yeah, you're right. We have to kind of think of the times it was written too, correct?
Right.
You know?
The audience.
Yes, ma'am, sure.
The author would have never written this book without the tragedy in his life.
Yes.
And I kind of go through what good can come out of what bad happens to you, instead of dwelling on what bad happens to you. What down the road would have happened, just like when we have a shooting and all of these foundations come and good comes to further people. So I'm not saying God does it one way or another, but good things can happen from tragedy, and it's how we choose to relate to it, to dwell on the bad or to see what good can come of it to help others.
No, that's very well said, and that is what he's trying to lead to, very much so. And I think we see it again in our resilience, rebound from tragedy. In terms of that.
One thing that I learned, and this is just a personal lesson, was that I could have been mad at God, and I might have been mad at God, but I misdirected it to myself in choosing to trust God, to not let happen what was happening to me. Does that make sense? It was my marriage that was falling apart, and I was trusting God that He was going to fix that. And I realized that I could have blamed God, but instead I was blaming myself for making a choice of trusting God. So it wasn't that I was blaming God, I was blaming myself for trusting God to fix it.
Somebody once said, pray like it all depends on God and work like it all depends on you.
Yeah, very good, very good.
That's the
Because
message.
then I had to learn to forgive myself, you know, so.
It's 11:32. We need to wrap up. And Mary, go ahead.
So, we always pray for people that are having surgery or something, so it makes it sound like these prayers aren't really doing any good, because they're gonna come out like they're gonna come out.
I would say that is basically what he is saying. That, but what he's saying is not so much that he's saying give the surgeon the ability to correct and help that person going through surgery.
Yeah.
You follow me? He's saying that, you know, it's the brilliance of the man or woman who's operating upon that person to help him or her get better, or give the researcher the ability to basically treat dementia or whatever the issue is. He says that's God's way of us dealing with that. You know, I can't directly, you know, to your question, I understand totally where you're coming from. And I would not pretend to say that I have an answer to that, but that's his approach to it in terms of it. The gift of the surgeon to fix a friend who's going through critical surgery, or to find again that disease for dementia or whatever it is that you're dealing with, and hoping that God giving us those people that will find that. And we've seen that in history, right? We've seen, look, I mean, I have to laugh. George Washington died of something that he could have taken a pill for.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that back in 1708, whatever it was, 87, when he passed away or something like that. Very small thing, but that's part of it called the evolution of humans.
Thank you, Doug, for a great discussion. God help us to understand what we can with our 3 pounds of brains.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye.
Washington has a throat infection.